The year is 2016, and for the first time in history, the best competitive Pokemon players in the world are just about ready to give up. This season, something happened that was thought to be impossible, something that had never happened before and has not happened again since. Somehow, despite there being over 700 Pokemon in the game, there is one clear best team, and its name is Big 6. It's not so unusual for there to be a best team in the game. In fact, at most points during a competitive Pokemon season, there tends to be a frontrunner in the teams to beat race. But don't let that fool you, because Big 6 was anything but usual. It appeared at the very beginning of the format, dominating the first American and European regionals, and continued to win nearly every event for the rest of the season. Whenever it looked like players had finally found a counter, Big 6 adapted, changing the rotating 6 slot in the team and emerging once again as the #1 team to beat. This longevity and this mutating adaptability set Big 6 apart from any other team in history, because while there have been other times where one team seemed more dominant, players had never before failed to find an answer. Big 6 is the only exception in history, and before the season had officially ended, we already knew the truth. Big 6 was, and still is, the strongest Pokemon team in history. We spent the entire season aware of Big 6's power, but any hope that it might be defeated was extinguished at US Nationals. This was the final tournament before the World Championships, and Big 6 not only placed both first and second, it also had 3 other variants placing in the top 8. US Nationals, which is now called North American Internationals, is a really important tournament. As the final major event before the World Championships, it's a pivotal tournament for players who want to qualify, and so it sets the groundwork for the World Championships by laying out clearly what the best teams are, with top players holding nothing back. To have one team perform so much better than the rest of the field after an entire season being beaten down by this very team was the worst sign for competitive players. It seemed like the world's winning team had already been decided. The only question was, which Big 6 player would be the one using it. But despite all the signs pointing towards Big 6 being the best team of all time, not everybody was ready to throw in the towel. In fact, our story today centers around one particularly stubborn player with a bad habit of ignoring the strongest Pokemon in the game for some less conventional picks. You see, I also attended US Nationals back in 2016, and I was ready to win it all with my team that I was sure could take down the monstrosity that was Big 6. With my red card Heatran's quadruple fairy resistance, I could tank a hit from the terrifying Xerneas and force it to switch out, losing all the stat boosts Geomancy provided. With my double intimidate core of Salamence and Scrafty, I could cut Primal Groudon's attack power dramatically. With my Dialga's Trick Room, I could flip the speed against faster Groudon, Xerneas, and Mega Salamence, then hit the Fairy Deer and Jet Plane for super effective damage. And with my own fast special attacking Primal Groudon, I could outspeed and KO opposing Primal Groudon. Last but not least, my Lumberry, Safeguard, Turbo Fast Cresselia could protect my team from the menace that was Dark Void Smeargle. With my team full of tricks and traps to take down Big 6, I reached #1 on both the in-game ladder and the Showdown ladder in the lead up to US Nationals, where I finished with a resounding 5 wins and 4 losses and a day 1 exit. At the time, it was my worst performance at this tournament ever. And truthfully, I was ready to throw in the towel, not just on the format, but on competitive Pokemon altogether. With my poor performance at Nationals, I lost my day 2 invitation to the World Championships, an absolutely absurd advantage that no longer exists, which would allow the top performers of a season to skip an entire day of competition. Despite my season featuring 2 regional wins and a regional top 4, I was out of the race. And if topping 2 of the ladders wasn't enough to guarantee me a good finish, what was even the point in working so hard? I had spent so much time preparing for US Nationals only to have it all blow up in my face. And having to sit in the sidelines with my creative team, watching 2 Big 6 teams play in the finals was demoralizing in ways I have trouble explaining. To add insult to injury, they wouldn't even let me into my apartment once I got back home. But after some time decompressing and talking with friends, I knew giving up before the World Championships was a decision that I'd grow to regret. And so, I sat down with my friend Marcus to try and figure out how to stop an unstoppable team. The 2016 format used a rule set called a dual restricted format. These formats allow players to use 2 legendary Pokemon that are normally banned on their teams. These days, you might see a variety of restricted Pokemon, but 2016 was our very first restricted format, and as such, there were very few good restricted Pokemon. Primal Groudon, Primal Kyogre, Xerneas, and Mega Rayquaza. Every single team in the top 36 of the tournament will use 2 of these 4 Pokemon, with one lone Yveltal placing 15th. I'd explored Dialga as a possible niche pick, but after Nationals, I'm convinced that it isn't strong enough. In other words, the starting point for any team that wants to beat Big Six has to begin with picking which 2 restricteds you want from a very short list. But this line of thinking is, at least in my opinion, exactly why Big Six has felt so impossible to beat. Because looking at the 4 restricted options, the 2 best Pokemon to beat Big Six are the same 2 restricteds that Big Six uses: Primal Groudon and Xerneas. Any other combination of 2 ends up with a fundamental weakness. Kyogre, Rayquaza, Xerneas and Kyogre, and Xerneas and Rayquaza teams all end up too weak against opposing Xerneas. Groudon and Kyogre teams struggle versus a well-supported Primal Groudon. Groudon and Rayquaza seemed promising after it performed well at Japan Nationals, but the fact that they both struggle with Mega Salamence meant that Big Six players could still stop them once they knew what to do. After only a cursory glance, it's clear. The best 2 restricteds against Xerneas and Groudon are Xerneas and Groudon. But what if you only wanted to use 1 restricted? If you wanted to beat Big Six and you didn't want to use both Primal Groudon and Xerneas yourself, there was one clear answer. Primal Kyogre. Primal Kyogre differs from regular Kyogre in 2 ways. First, in exchange for giving up its held item, it effectively receives a Mega Evolution, gaining a gross amount of stats. Second, rather than setting the reign with its Drizzle ability, Primal Kyogre instead summons the Primordial Sea. Primordial Sea sets one of 3 types of Primal Weather. These enhanced weather conditions cannot be overwritten by the normal weather conditions of sun, rain, hail, or sand. And they also don't expire after 5 turns like traditional weather. Instead, Primal Weather will only cease when the user leaves the battlefield via a switch or a KO, or if it is overwritten by another form of Primal Weather. Primal Groudon has one clear-cut weakness, one tiny Achilles heel holding up an otherwise untouchable Pokemon. Unlike regular Groudon, who is a pure ground type, Primal Groudon is a ground and fire type, meaning it has a quadruple weakness to water. But abusing this weakness is easier said than done, because Groudon's Desolate Land ability sets up Primal Sunlight, and when Primal Sun is active, all water moves evaporate, dealing 0 damage. In other words, if you can hit Primal Groudon with a water move, you can probably KO it in just a single hit. But actually getting to Primal Groudon while Desolate Land is active requires some way of shutting down the sun. For example, Primal Weather of your own. So immediately, you're looking at either Kyogre or Rayquaza, and Kyogre is the standout pick. While Rayquaza's Airlock ability works even before it Mega Evolves and gains access to its Primal Weather, it's just not a good user of Water-type attacks. And Rayquaza being weak to Xerneas makes it a liability. Kyogre, on the other hand, is an excellent user of Water-type moves. There's a pro tip for you. And because it gains so many stat points in its Primal form, even boosted Xerneas cannot KO it in one hit. While Kyogre still doesn't have a good matchup against Xerneas, it can at least tank a hit and then deal with Groudon before it goes down. These history of competitive Pokemon videos are something that I want to do more of going forward. So if you're enjoying this video and you want to hear more cool stories from the history of this game, make sure that you're subscribed. A surprisingly large number of my viewers are not subscribed, and so if it's something that you're enjoying and you want to see more of it, just do me a favor and double check. Whenever I say this, there's always people who are surprised to learn that they are not subscribed despite watching like every video. Anyway, there was one major problem with Kyogre. In the right positions, Kyogre could do well against Xerneas or Groudon, but trying to handle both of them at once was inconsistent, especially when you consider the supporting cast. Kyogre's partner would have to be a Pokemon that handled those supporting Pokemon, improving your matchup against the supporting pieces and enabling Kyogre to do its job. But here we run into the problem that players have been struggling with all season. If you look at the other restricted Pokemon, there isn't one that meets these criteria. There just isn't another restricted Pokemon that can help against all Big Six variants, which is why the next Pokemon on this team is not a restricted Pokemon. In 2016, there was another type of Pokemon far stronger than your average Joe: Mega Evolutions. Mega Evolution is a mechanic that functions very similarly to Terastallization. Once per game, you click a button and your Pokemon transforms until the end of the battle, or they're knocked out. The main difference is that Mega Evolutions are way way stronger than Terra Pokemon. Rather than putting on a sparkly hat, they receive a massive stat increase and sometimes change their typing and or ability. On the whole, they aren't quite as strong as a restricted Pokemon, but they're a lot closer than anything else in the game. And here, on this team, it is the Mega Evolution that takes the place of restricted Pokemon in the battle against Big Six, thanks to the control provided by Mega Gengar. When Marcus and I sat down to build a team that could stop Big Six, one of the biggest questions we had to answer was, how on earth are we gonna stop Xerneas? I made an entire video breaking down Big Six, the individual Pokemon, why it was so unstoppable, how the team adapted and overcame all counterplay during the course of the season. I do recommend that you watch it before you finish this video so you can fully understand just why this team was so unbeatable. But as a quick refresher, Xerneas is the strongest Pokemon ever made thanks to its signature move Geomancy, which doubles 3 of the 4 stats that it cares about. After a boost, Xerneas outputs massive damage and is nearly impossible to remove. And that's not even factoring in all the different support that it can have. While Primal Groudon in theory has one clear-cut counter, which is to hit it with water moves, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to Xerneas. It is simply too flexible, too versatile, and too hard to pin down, which is where Mega Gengar comes in. Gengar's typing doesn't change when it Mega evolves. It stays a ghost and poison type Pokemon, but what does change is its ability. Gengar loses its immunity to ground, but gains one of the single best abilities in the entire game, Shadow Tag, an ability that stops your opponent from switching as long as the Shadow Tag user is on the field. Shadow Tag is a crucial part of stopping Xerneas, because it halts the supporting cast from dancing around, keeping the deer safe from danger. Without Shadow Tag, your opponent can freely reposition, bringing in support Pokemon like Smeargle and Talonflame to run interference, or secondary offensive threats like Mega Kangaskhan and Primal Groudon to finish off whichever Pokemon can survive Xerneas' onslaught. With Shadow Tag, your opponent is forced to make a choice. Any Pokemon on the field when Gengar Mega evolves won't be getting out until either they or Gengar are knocked out. But trapping Xerneas on the field doesn't do much unless you can stop it. With a Pokemon this strong, it's easy to end up in a situation where you think you've trapped them in here with you, when really you're trapped in here with them. Thankfully, Gengar can do more than just trap. Thanks to its natural speed, it can move before Xerneas attacks. Thanks to its ghost typing, it's immune to fake out. And thanks to its poison typing, it can actually hit Xerneas for super effective damage. But even all of this, Shadow Tag, ghost and poison typing, a high base speed, it wasn't enough to allow Gengar to consistently beat Xerneas. While it did work sometimes, the issue was in the supporting cast. Yes, if you were somehow at the end of the game in a 1-against-1 and both Pokemon on full HP and there were no stat boosts or speed control effects or whatever in play, Gengar would win. But what about when Xerneas was paired with Mega Kangaskhan that could pressure Gengar with Sucker Punch? What about when the Smeargle used Follow Me instead of Fake Out and saved Xerneas from Sludge Bomb? What if Mega Salamence picked up a KO with Double Edge? Many players had tried Mega Gengar, and while it did work sometimes, it just wasn't consistent enough. Xerneas had too many tools at its disposal, which is why it was so crucial that Mega Gengar had the correct 4 moves. You see, Gengar has a problem. It has a ridiculously deep move pool. On paper, this is an advantage, but in practice, it muddied the waters for players trying to make Gengar work. Should you use Hidden Power Water to KO Primal Groudon on the same turn that you switch in Kyogre? What about Icy Wind for speed control and to break Focus Ashes? Disable can swing a fight against a choice-locked Pokemon. And of course, there's always the very tempting Perish Song. What about Shadow Ball for a secondary attack? And there's Haze that can remove the stat boost of Xerneas that's already boosted. Maybe even Destiny Bond could work in a pinch. With so many options to choose from, it was rare for any two Gengar to run the exact same 4 moves. But stopping Big Six isn't a task you can solve without precision. Gengar only gets 4 moves, and we needed to make every one of them count. 2 of the moves are fixed. Gengar needs Protect to stay alive, and Sludge Bomb to damage Xerneas. But what next? The secret lies in Gengar's ability, Shadow Tag, because remember, Xerneas is the strongest Pokemon ever made, and with all the support it has, it is nearly impossible to stop it from getting boosted. But if you can't stop it from setting up, what are you supposed to do? Simple. Turn the battle into a 2-against-1. Xerneas has two partners that are more dangerous than the rest, Smeargle and Mega Kangaskhan. 2016 Smeargle is the most evil Pokemon ever made. With Dark Void, it could disable your entire team, and with its signature gimmick of learning every move in the game, it could use literally any supporting move to protect Xerneas from harm. Fake Out, Follow Me, Wide Guard, Tailwind, and more, everything a Pokemon might want, Smeargle had. This was even more dangerous in 2016 because we were playing with something called closed team sheets. Nowadays at a Pokemon tournament, we play open team sheets, which means you're given information about what moves, items, and abilities your opponent's Pokemon have before a battle begins. But back then, you weren't given anything. So Smeargle could literally learn every move in the game, and you wouldn't know for sure which 4 moves they had until you'd seen every single one of them. So, despite some of the worst stats of any competitively viable Pokemon ever made, Smeargle was a living nightmare this year, dominating tournament after tournament. But it does have one weakness, and it happens to be tied to those terrible stats. All of the threatening moves that Smeargle can use don't do very much damage, which is why the third move on our Mega Gengar was Taunt. Normally, Taunt is like only a so-so effective answer to Smeargle, because yeah, while it does stop them for a turn, it can always just switch out to reset the taunt and then come back in again later and cause trouble then. Plus, the turn you spent taunting probably allowed Xerneas to set up anyway. But what happens if Smeargle can't switch out? Well, in that case, it would turn the battle into a 2 against 1, as Smeargle is forced to either struggle or use a Fake Out that fails every single turn until the taunt wears off. And Xerneas is a strong enough Pokemon to win many 2 against 1s. But with Mega Gengar as one of the Pokemon on the field, even a boosted Xerneas should be a little bit nervous. Taunt has the added benefit of working against many of the alternate supporting casts that Xerneas can run. Some versions use Clefairy or Amoonguss instead of or in addition to Smeargle, but once taunted, they're all functionally the same. A Pokemon you wish your opponent would just knock out already. Taunt also works on Xerneas itself to disable not only Protect, but also Geomancy if Xerneas hadn't already boosted. While normally you would prefer to Sludge Bomb, there are some positions like against Sucker Punch where Taunt is better. With Taunt and Shadow Tag, Gengar excels against the supporting cast Xerneas runs. But what about the secondary offensive threats? What about Mega Kangaskhan, Mega Salamence, Primal Groudon? We'll get to Groudon and Mence in a second. Right now, let's focus on Kangaskhan, one of the most dangerous partners for Xerneas. It could support Xerneas getting boosted with Fake Out, set up itself with Power Up Punch, or just go for raw damage with Double Edge or Return. In theory, Mega Gengar's Ghost typing should give it a huge edge over the most popular Mega in the game. But the issue is that Dark type move Sucker Punch, which not only hits Gengar for super effective damage, but also has increased priority, meaning it goes first despite Gengar being the faster Pokemon. With Sucker Punch in play, Gengar just can't safely go for Sludge Bomb, and Taunt is a really useless move against Kangaskhan, which is where Gengar's last move finally comes into play. Will-O-Wisp. See, Sucker Punch only works if the target goes for an attacking move, otherwise it'll fail. With Will-O-Wisp, Gengar can not only trap Kangaskhan on the field, it can cut its damage output in half. Keep in mind that in Generation 6, Burn did double the damage it does now, meaning it would actually wear down threats pretty quickly. After a burn, Gengar could go for Sludge Bomb safely, or it could taunt Kangaskhan's partner. With Taunt and Will-O-Wisp, Mega Gengar alone could shut down one of the most dangerous leads from Big 6, Smeargle and Kangaskhan. And it also excelled at seizing control of the game by turning battles into a 2 against 1 if either Kang or Smeargle showed up. But despite this Gengar being literally designed to shut down Big 6, there were still some holes in the game plan. And one of the biggest ones, if you can believe it, was somehow still Xerneas. See, if the Big 6 player wanted, they could still get Geomancy set up. By using Smeargle with Follow Me, Gengar is forced to waste a turn using Taunt while Xerneas boosts. And while Primal Kyogre and Mega Gengar can work together to beat a boosted Xerneas, they may take too much damage in the process, allowing the opponent's Primal Groudon or Mega Salamence to clean up. One Pokemon fully dedicated to stopping Xerneas just wasn't enough. Its strength was just too immense, which is why we added a second. Bronzong is one of the best Pokemon ever made, is what I would say if I was lying. In fact, outside of the final part of 2016, it has rarely seen any usage. And so you might be surprised to learn that it was a crucial part of beating the strongest team ever made. In order to beat the strongest Pokemon, surely you have to use the strongest Pokemon yourself, right? It's a line of thinking that makes sense, but it is missing a crucial qualifier. In order to beat the strongest Pokemon, you have to use the strongest Pokemon against specifically those Pokemon. And that's where Bronzong shines. Bronzong is an incredibly slow and tanky Pokemon with a toolkit seemingly designed to shut down Big 6. The most important part of its arsenal is its typing. As a steel and psychic type, it resists Xerneas's fairy type moves, and it is so immensely bulky that if you train it heavily in its HP and special defense, it can even survive 2 Xerneas Moonblasts after a Geomancy. In 2016, there were very few Pokemon that could say this, and most of them were not very good. But surviving the hits alone just isn't enough. Bronzong had to actually be able to do something after. Fortunately, it can, because as a psychic type, Bronzong gets access to Trick Room, flipping the order in which Pokemon move. Part of what makes Xerneas so threatening is the fact that Geomancy doubles its speed, allowing it to outspeed every Pokemon without a speed boost of their own. But Trick Room turns that speed boost into a negative, forcing Xerneas to be the last to move rather than the first. But taking a hit and then setting up Trick Room isn't enough for a Pokemon to beat Xerneas, because remember, Xerneas also doubles its special bulk. If it can survive a hit inside a Trick Room, it can still do so much damage that its partners can clean up when, or if, it does eventually go down. So far, both Pokemon we're using to beat Big 6 are special attackers, and unfortunately, Bronzong is a bulky Pokemon without a very high attack stat. To make matters worse, in order to survive 2 boosted Moonblasts, nearly all of the stat points have to go into Bronzong's special defense and HP stats, and Xerneas have become even bulkier going into Worlds, making them even harder to remove. Is there any way for Bronzong to actually damage Xerneas? Actually, yeah. And it's by turning Geomancy against Xerneas once more. You see, a Pokemon's attacking stat isn't the only thing to consider when factoring in how much damage your Pokemon's gonna do. You also have to consider how strong the move is that you're using. As an example, this is probably the reason why Game Freak gave the new Pokemon Tinkaton such a low attacking stat. Because its signature move Gigaton Hammer is just so strong, they realized that if it had a good attack stat, it would probably do too much damage. And okay, I mean, Tinkaton came out in Generation 9 and Bronzong's a Gen 4 Pokemon, so you might not see like how this is relevant. Because if you sort Bronzong's strongest steel type moves from strongest to weakest in Generation 6, the top move that shows up will be Iron Head, an 80 base power move. But there is another move that we can use, a move that gets stronger the faster the target is compared to the user. Gyro Ball. Gyro Ball is a move with variable base power. In theory, it can be as weak as 1 base power, the single weakest a move can possibly be. But for Bronzong, that is never the case, because it becomes stronger and stronger the faster the target is compared to the user. And at maximum power, Gyro Ball reaches a whopping 150 base power, a Hyper Beam that doesn't miss and doesn't need a recharge turn. Now, you need to be a lot slower than your target if you want to reach this 150 base power. So much so that the slowest Bronzong doesn't even reach it against the fastest Xerneas. But here's the catch. When Xerneas doubles its special attack and special defense with Geomancy, it is also forced to double its speed, and that maxes out the power of Gyro Ball. Gyro Ball is unlikely to KO Xerneas in a single hit, even after a Geomancy, but it should always do at least 70%, and often it would be closer to 80%. Enough that a Sludge Bomb from Mega Gengar or Origin Pulse from Kyogre will finish it off. And thanks to Trick Room, you can safely double Xerneas before it attacks, once again turning its doubled speed into a hindrance rather than a help. Of course, Xerneas could just switch out in front of Bronzong, except that Mega Gengar's Shadow Tag prevents that. Xerneas is not forced to Geomancy, but the issue is that with Gengar's Poison type and Bronzong's Steel type, it isn't actually able to do much without its special attack boosts. It will take 5 Moonblasts to KO Bronzong, whereas 2 Gyro Balls will still likely KO Xerneas even if they haven't set up. Xerneas players thus far have beaten Bronzong by relying on their support, using Smeargle's Follow Me or Dark Void to protect it, bringing in Primal Groudon to KO it, but with Shadow Tag and Taunt, these options are removed. One of the most dangerous and versatile Pokemon was, for the first time, close to being fully locked down. But there were still some options it had left, some final tricks up its sleeve. We'll get to those in a second though, because we still have more to talk about when it comes to the bell. I told you that Bronzong was a Pokemon designed to shut down Big 6, but so far, I've really only talked about beating Xerneas. It is true that Bronzong was incredible versus Xerneas, but there's more that it can do. You may have mentioned that the thus far, I've only talked about 2 of Bronzong's 4 moves, Trick Room and Gyro Ball. Similar to Mega Gengar, the last 2 moves are chosen specifically to shut down the rest of the team. And you can probably guess that target number 1 is my sworn enemy, Smeargle. Bronzong is a move that is almost never used, but was excellent in the 2016 metagame, Safeguard. Safeguard prevents your Pokemon from being inflicted with status conditions for the next 5 turns. Bronzong dedicates an entire move slot just to stopping Dark Void from Smeargle. Though it has some other uses as well, like against Hypnosis Bronzong and Sporamungus. And this might seem a little redundant because, like I already told you, Taunt on Mega Gengar is here to stop Dark Void Smeargle. So then why do we need Safeguard? Remember, the key strength of Big 6 was its versatility. The Pokemon are so strong and so flexible that there's many different approaches you can take to any given matchup. Smeargle can be used up front, yes, but it can also be used in the back. What if the opponent builds a game plan around getting Smeargle inside of Tailwind, or after they've already dealt with Gengar? With Safeguard, Bronzong acts as a secondary line of defense, and also is stronger against Choice Scarf or Mental Herb versions of Smeargle. Now, there is an elephant in the room. Bronzong is much slower than Smeargle, so if Trick Room isn't up, Dark Void can put Bronzong to sleep before it can use Safeguard. And that would be true if my Bronzong didn't hold the Lumberry, waking it up 1 time from sleep, but 1 time is enough to set up Trick Room or Safeguard. With Lumberry and Safeguard, Bronzong could prevent my entire team from falling into Smeargle's nightmare, assuming they got past Mega Gengar in the first place, which just leaves one last move that we need to talk about. You may have noticed thus far that most of the focus on this team has been on Xerneas and Smeargle, and that's because these are the 2 Pokemon that have the easiest time running away with the game, but they aren't the only threats on this team, and there's one major threat in particular that I've been neglecting. Primal Groudon. In theory, Primal Kyogre beats Primal Groudon, but that is only true if the Primordial Sea is active. Remember that in the Sun, Desolate Land causes all water moves to do 0 damage. On this team, Marcus and I decided to run a bulky Kyogre with a little bit of speed, but not enough to outspeed the majority of Primal Groudon. So Trick Room is part of the answer here, allowing Kyogre to attack first. But what good is attacking first if Desolate Land is active? Now, I have to double back a little bit and tell you that earlier, I made a generalization that was perhaps a little bit too broad. I told you that the only way to remove Primal Weather is for the Pokemon to leave the battlefield via a KO or a switch, or for another form of Primal Weather to come in and overwrite the existing one. But the truth is, there's another way to reset the weather that doesn't involve any Pokemon leaving the field. What the game actually cares about is not whether the Pokemon leaves the field, it's whether the ability itself leaves the field. But the primal abilities are tied to the Pokemon, so why does this distinction matter? Because of Bronzong's final move, Skill Swap. Skill Swap is one of my all-time favorite moves. 4 years prior, I'd used it to place second at the World Championships. Skill Swap switches the abilities of the user and the target. I'd used it in 2012 to give my Heatran, a Pokemon normally quadruple weak to ground, the Levitate ability of my Cresselia, which gave it a ground immunity. Now, what's interesting about Skill Swap is that when used, it reactivates abilities that normally happen on switch-in, like Intimidate, like Slow Start, like Primordial Sea. If Bronzong uses Skill Swap on Primal Kyogre, it will reactivate the Primordial Sea even if Desolate Land is currently active. Even more devastating, Kyogre will then gain access to Bronzong's Levitate ability, making it completely immune to ground-type moves. Nearly every Primal Groudon at the time ran only fire and ground moves. The standard set was Protect, Precipice Blades, Fire Punch, and one of Eruption, Substitute, or Swords Dance. In other words, Primal Groudon is completely incapable of damaging a Pokemon immune to ground in the rain, including a floating Kyogre. Groudon is supposed to be the last line of defense against Kyogre for Big 6. Normally, you don't need to use it because you either outpace it with Xerneas, disable it with Smeargle, or just outspeed and KO it with Mega Kangaskhan or Mega Salamence. However, as a last resort, you can always use Groudon to save your team from the strongest water-type attacker in history. Even if you lose control of the weather, Groudon can do enough damage to Kyogre with Precipice Blades that your other Pokemon can probably finish the job. Unless, of course, that Kyogre has Levitate. And the true brutality of the Bronzong Kyogre combo is that with Skill Swap, you not only become completely immune to Groudon, but you also ensure that you have control of the weather even if Desolate Land was already active. The combo is even stronger when you consider that you can preemptively Skill Swap to prevent Primal Groudon from switching in and denying you Water Spout. If Groudon doesn't switch in, you just Skill Swap again the next turn. But if it did, then you've probably won the game. Big 6 is a team that thrives on speed and offense, but inside Trick Room, in in the Primordial Sea, everything could quickly fall apart. So now that I've explained all the moves, you probably think you understand just why Bronzong was so good here, and why it was the perfect Pokemon to help counter Big 6. But actually, here's the thing. I'm not done talking about skill swap, because Primal Groudon isn't the only Pokemon on the team that relies on its ability. The two Mega Evolutions that Big 6 ran, Mega Kangaskhan and Mega Salamence, have two of the best abilities in the game. Mega Kangaskhan's Parental Bond causes all its moves to hit twice, with the second one being half as strong. And Mega Salamence's Aerialate turns all its normal moves into flying moves, and gives them a whopping 30% damage boost. These are incredible abilities, but that's actually a weakness here, because if Bronzong steals them, these Pokemon would be rendered nearly useless. Just like Gengar can turn the battle into a 2-against-1 against Smeargle and Kangaskhan, so too can Bronzong turn the battle into a 2-against-1 against Salamence and Kangaskhan. If you remove Aerialate, Salamence actually cannot damage Mega Gengar at all, as its normal type moves are no longer flying type. Kyogre, Gengar, and Bronzong. These three Pokemon form the bedrock of a core that can actually take on Big 6. Remember that in the official competitive format, despite there being 6 Pokemon on a team, you can only bring 4 Pokemon to each match. In other words, we only had one more Pokemon slot that could come against Big 6 to patch the remaining holes against every possible variant. And again, the obvious answer is our second restricted Pokemon, which we haven't used yet. It could be Rayquaza to help against Groudon, maybe Groudon to help take on Xerneas, maybe our own Xerneas. Well, as fate would have it, the answer is none of them. Because if the answer was to find the 2 restricted Pokemon that could beat Big 6, we wouldn't have gotten to this point in the first place. So our second restricted Pokemon has to come later. Right now, we have to address something else. With the core that the team has, there is one clear weakness. Burst damage. Yes, Gengar and Bronzong can slow down Xerneas and disable Kangaskhan, Smeargle, and Salamence, but can they do it without first getting run over by Primal Groudon, by Mega Salamence? Kyogre can deal with Primal Groudon, but it doesn't really like switching in against Precipice Blades and losing half its health. And the only Pokemon that can tank Salamence's flying attacks is Bronzong. What the team needs at this point isn't more offense. It's a way to slow down the pace of Big 6 while I gradually seize control. A Pokemon that can switch in and out freely, weakening my opponents and halting their momentum. A Pokemon that turns the battle into a dance. Here's the problem with the team thus far. There is no good lead against Big 6. Gengar absolutely wants to be in the lead to get Shadow Tag online as fast as possible. But what should you send out with it? It can't be Kyogre. Shadow Tag isn't active on the first turn, and so your opponent could just switch in Groudon or lead with a slower Groudon, and you're immediately forced to scramble. But Bronzong wants to be able to switch in with full HP only after your opponent commits to setting up Xerneas. Starting with it early means risking its health, and also means that you're starting with 2 Pokemon that can't touch Groudon. Beyond that, Gengar and Bronzong lead just straight up loses to Kangaskhan Groudon and Smeargle Groudon in a major way. It won't work. Hitmontop was not a popular Pokemon at the time. In fact, there was only one single Hitmontop in top cut of US Nationals, placing 18th. And so you might think that Hitmontop just can't keep up, especially against Pokemon like Xerneas and Mega Salamence. But again, beating Big 6 isn't about using the strongest Pokemon. It's about using the strongest Pokemon for the job. And just like Bronzong, Hitmontop proves to be a specialist. The first piece of the puzzle is Hitmontop's ability, Intimidate. It weakens the physical attack stats of both opponents' Pokemon every time Hitmontop switches in. Gengar, Bronzong, and Kyogre are all bulkier on the special side. Intimidate helps compensate. Intimidate also changes important damage rolls, allowing Gengar to survive Salamence's Double Edge and giving Kyogre good odds to survive 2 Kangaskhan Double Edges. Intimidate also has excellent synergy with Shadow Tag, as the best way to remove stat drops is to switch out, which Gengar prevents. But there's lots of good Intimidate Pokemon, so why choose Hitmontop specifically? The answer is the specific moves that Hitmontop learns. Probably the most important is Fake Out. Hitmontop is intended to be led alongside Gengar, and the turn where Gengar is the most vulnerable is the first turn before its Mega Evolution is online. Gengar can turn the battle into a 2-against-1 by taunting Smeargle or burning Kangaskhan, but on the turn where it does this, it's vulnerable to an attack from the partner. So, in keeping with the trend of disabling Pokemon, Hitmontop makes it a 1-against-1 for that one turn only, creating its own turn to disable a crucial threat with Fake Out, protecting Gengar while it Mega Evolves. As it turns out, sometimes one turn is all you need. Faygo can also be used to set Trick Room or stop a key threat from moving at any point in the battle. It's an extremely versatile move that you're never upset to have. There is even more synergy with the final two members of the team, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Hitmontop does need some way to do damage, and its strongest option is close combat. It's probably the least used move on Hitmontop, but it is important because it's the only move in the entire team that can hit Dialga for super effective damage, and one of only two moves that can hit it for even neutral damage, with the other one being Kyogre's Ice Beam. Dialga resists literally every single other move on the team, so in a pinch, all we have is Hitmontop to clear it. Hitmontop has two moves left, and just like Bronzong and Gengar, these moves need to provide some utility for the team. But for the first time, there's something else Marcus and I needed to consider when building this team. So far, my entire focus has been on beating Big Six, and that makes sense because it is the strongest team in history, okay? But in order to win the World Championships, we were gonna have to beat all the other teams too. Dual Primals, X-Ray, Kyogre. Building an entire team dedicated to beating Big Six wouldn't be enough. Whatever we used would need to beat both Big Six and every other team. And so we built this team using the concept of modes. A mode is a collection of 4 Pokemon intended to be brought together. This team only has 2 modes. The anti-Big Six mode you've already seen with Gengar, Hitmontop, Kyogre, and Bronzong. But we needed another mode to handle everything else. And 2 of the Pokemon that we were bringing versus Big Six would also need to come here. Gengar and Bronzong are specialists, and they're really only here for this matchup against Big Six, which means that Kyogre and Hitmontop need to come versus everything else. So Hitmontop's last 2 moves need to be good not only against Big Six, but also good against the rest of the field. Fortunately, there was a clear standout choice: Wide Guard. This move protects your entire team from spread moves like Water Spout, Origin Pulse, and Dazzling Gleam. Wide Guard is always good when restricted Pokemon are around, but it's especially good when Primal Groudon is in play. Remember, while Groudon can switch in against Kyogre's Water-type moves because Desolate Land will cause them to fizzle out, Kyogre is unable to switch into Groudon's Ground-type moves because Primordial Sea affects Fire-type moves, not Ground. However, you may also remember that Groudon typically only runs Fire moves and Precipice Blades, which is not only a ground move, but it's also a spread move. So, if Kyogre switches in against Groudon and Hitmontop protects it with Wide Guard, both Kyogre and Hitmontop are fully immune to everything Groudon can do. Wide Guard is also great against other Kyogres, as the standard set at Worlds featured only spread water moves like Origin Pulse and Water Spout. It's a move that is great against Big Six because it's good generally, and it allows Hitmontop to always contribute whenever it's brought. With just 1 move left, I think the most obvious answer here is Helping Hand, a move that boosts your partner's damage output by 50%, which is just a universally good buff to have on hand. Instead, however, Marcus and I settled on Feint. This move goes first and breaks protecting moves, including Protect of course, but also Wide Guard. Our Kyogre, like most of them this tournament, ran both Water Spout and Origin Pulse, meaning Wide Guard could fully shut it down, but with Feint on Hitmontop, we could break through. The core philosophy of this team is to limit your opponent's options, eventually leaving them with no way to win. Shadow Tag, Safeguard, Skill Swap, Trick Room, Taunt, Fake Out, Will-O-Wisp, Wide Guard. All of these tools can be used to close off your opponent's options, and Feint is the cherry on top. With Feint, you don't need to play a guessing game of whether an opponent will click Protect or Wide Guard. You can simply click Feint and attack regardless. Moves and ability are squared away, which means that it's time to talk about the single hardest decision we had to make when it came to using Hitmontop: the item. Here's a fun fact that I like. The only time this item has ever won the World Championships was on this team, on this Hitmontop. And that's because it's an item that typically makes your Pokemon harder to use, not easier. However, if you understand what you're getting into, it can be one of the most skill-expressive items in the game. This is the Eject button. Eject button causes the holder to switch out the first time they're hit by an attack, even if they haven't gotten to move for the turn. This is an item that, generally speaking, makes your Pokemon worse. However, it's what turned this Hitmontop into World Champion material. Here's why. First, 3 of Hitmontop's 4 moves have priority, meaning it's actually very difficult to activate Eject button to get rid of it before Hitmontop has moved. Second, Intimidate activates whenever Hitmontop switches in, and Fake Out is only usable the first turn after Hitmontop hits the field. Both Intimidate and Fake Out get more value the more times you can switch your Pokemon in during a battle, and if you want to switch in, you first have to switch out. Third, Eject button allows Hitmontop to be a health pack for the more important Pokemon like the restricteds. Kyogre's in danger, bring in Hitmontop, tank the hit, and get it in safely again. Sun's up and Kyogre's already on the field. Switch Kyogre into Hitmontop, tank the Precipice Blades, and come right back in, winning the Weather War with an Intimidate down to boot. Eject button works especially well against Big 6. Hitmontop starts the battle in the lead, providing Intimidate and Fake Out support right away. But if it's attacked and forced to switch, you can bring in Bronzong in front of Xerneas, Salamence, Kangaskhan, or Smeargle, or Kyogre if you've already trapped the Groudon on the field. You get the added benefit of saving Hitmontop for later, for a sacrifice, or for another round of Fake Out and Intimidate. Like I said, a core theme of this team was control, especially against Big 6. This team offered so much control, in fact, that Marcus and I built a complex branching flowchart using these 4 Pokemon. A flowchart that could beat every single Big 6 variant, no matter what they led or what moves they made. This is the only time in my career where I felt like a battle was decided at team preview, where I didn't even need to think about my moves. I already knew what move I'd make no matter what the opponent did. At the World Championships, I played versus 4 Big 6 teams, and I beat all of them without dropping a game. One of these sets was recorded against Big C, a variant with Clefairy. I'll show it to you here so you can get a sense of how things worked even when things didn't go perfectly. Hitmontop and Gengar stare down Salamence and Talonflame, a lead that I haven't explicitly talked about yet. And the turn 1 looks like it goes poorly. My opponent reveals Quick Guard, blocking my Hitmontop's Fake Out. And while Gengar damages Talonflame, Hyper Voice deals a ton to both of my Pokemon. But I trained Hitmontop to survive this very move. An eject button activates, allowing me to bring in Bronzong. On the next turn, Flare Blitz deals a ton of damage to Bronzong, but knocks Talonflame out with the recoil. And though Gengar damaged Salamence with Sludge Bomb, Hyper Voice KOs Gengar and leaves Bronzong with low HP. However, now the game is functionally over, as Bronzong sets up Trick Room. Kyogre comes out, and despite both Bronzong and Hitmontop being low HP, the combination of Skill Swap and Water Spout is just too devastating for my opponent to handle. Over the next 3 turns, Bronzong will continue to click Skill Swap, and Kyogre will continue to click Water Spout, and the game ends without me taking another point of damage. Game 2 starts with the same leads, with my Gengar and Hitmontop against their Talonflame and Salamence. Once again, the turn 1 doesn't look great. My Hitmontop uses Wide Guard and fails to block anything as their Talonflame's Flare Blitz hits Gengar and burns it. My Will-O-Wisp hits Salamence, which burns it and allows Gengar to survive the incoming double edge, but because of the burn, Gengar faints anyway. I send out Bronzong to replace Gengar. They try and KO Bronzong by switching in Primal Groudon and using Flare Blitz, but I switch Kyogre in and cause the fire move to fizzle out while I set up Trick Room. Water Spout lands a double KO next turn, as I skill swap Primordial Sea onto Bronzong for later. They go into Clefairy and Groudon, but I still have Eject button active, and I switch Hitmontop in to take the Precipice Blades, lowering Groudon's attack and getting Kyogre in once more. They try and Encore me into Skill Swap, but I switch in Hitmontop and Water Spout, and one more Water Spout wins the game. Big 6 was a team known for its flexibility, for its ability to adapt and overcome no matter the situation, by using Pokemon, moves, and abilities that limited its vast number of options to a much more reasonable amount. This team was able to abuse some of the limited weaknesses that Big 6 had, specifically to a well-supported Primal Kyogre inside of Trick Room. With the hours spent staring at the team builder, with all of the theory and practice spent on beating Big 6, with the complex branching flowchart designed to cover every move, every option, every moody boost, we had done something thought to be impossible. We had a safe, consistent, winning matchup against the strongest team in history. But that wasn't enough to win Worlds, because this team still has 2 open slots, and there are many more teams we still have to beat. And so it is finally time to add our second restricted Pokemon. You may be surprised to hear that in 2016, Rayquaza was pretty solidly the 4th best restricted Pokemon behind Groudon, Kyogre, and Xerneas. This is surprising, because Mega Rayquaza has the most total stat points out of any Pokemon ever made, an ability that cannot have been designed with competitive balance in mind, and one of the most phenomenal move pools in the franchise. It also is the only Pokemon able to Mega Evolve without using a held item, allowing you to actually use an item to multiply its damage or to extend its lifespan. But there's a good reason why it's considered the 4th best restricted Pokemon. It lacks something that Xerneas, Groudon, and Kyogre all have: a spread move. In double battles, having your souped up legendary hit both your opponent's Pokemon is a big deal, as you saw in the battles I just showed you, where Kyogre clicked Water Spout 4 times in a row to win. It's not that a restricted Pokemon needs a spread move in order to be good, but it does require a bit more precision when you need to actually pick a target rather than just clicking the easy button. But despite its lack of spread damage, Mega Rayquaza is the only choice for this team. Remember, it's not needed to beat Groudon and Xerneas teams, but it does have to beat everything else. And right now, there is a whale of a problem Pokemon that needs to be addressed. Primal Kyogre. While my own Primal Groudon could in theory work against Primal Kyogre as well, I've never liked teams with Pokemon that get in the way of each other. And if my opponent has tricks that can reclaim the weather, we've already seen how fast Groudon gets washed out. Rayquaza on paper might seem like a strange choice to use to beat opposing Kyogre. After all, it does have a quadruple weakness to the ice moves that they so often run as coverage. But it is so strong that even without any attack boosts or an item that boosts its attack further, its signature move Dragon Ascent is able to do ridiculous damage, dropping opposing Kyogre to low HP. Even if the opponent then gets speed control, Rayquaza's other damaging move is Extreme Speed, a powerful move with heightened priority that does more damage than you might expect when used by Mega Rayquaza. Rayquaza has more use than simply smacking Kyogre around though. It has 2 useful abilities in battle, one before Mega Evolving and one after. Rayquaza starts the battle out with Airlock, an ability that nullifies all weather but only while the Pokemon is on the field. Importantly, this includes the Primal Weather. So if your opponent has Primal Groudon out in Desolate Land against Primal Kyogre, you can switch regular Rayquaza in and go for a KO with a water move. Airlock changes to Delta Stream, the third and final Primal Weather. Delta Stream doesn't give a damage boost to any moves, unlike the other forms of Primal Weather, but it does eliminate all weaknesses from flying type Pokemon in play. Delta Stream's main use on this team is to eliminate my opponent's weather rather than to extend Rayquaza's life. While the weakness removing effect is absurd, my Rayquaza didn't rely on it too much because it wasn't supposed to stick around for a long time. Rather than going with an item that could boost its damage like Choice Band or Life Orb, or an item that could increase its bulk like Assault Vest, Marcus and I settled on Focus Sash Rayquaza. Its signature move Dragon Ascent drops its defenses, and Focus Sash provides some nice insurance that Rayquaza can stick around for more than one attack. Just like in canon, Rayquaza's here to handle both Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre teams. Against Primal Kyogre, Rayquaza could go for an immediate Dragon Ascent to cut the power of Water Spout, or it could try and set up with Swords Dance and then go for a one-shot. With Fake Out support, opponents could never play passive or Rayquaza could just set up in their face. Of course, attacking Rayquaza directly risked taking a massive Dragon Ascent, so opponents had to guess right at all times or risk falling behind in a big way. And while the main Primal Groudon team paired it with Xerneas, it wasn't the only time the land monster showed up. In fact, one of the main compositions to beat going into Worlds was called Dual Primals, and as you might expect, these teams used both Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre. Mega Rayquaza could threaten Kyogre directly while simultaneously clearing a path for my Kyogre to handle their Groudon. It was the perfect second restricted Pokemon for this team. Mega Rayquaza had especially great synergy with Hitmontop, especially with the eject button. Eject button opened up plays that would otherwise be impossible, such as this one from a regional tournament following the World Championships where I brought a team similar to the one that I used at Worlds. The position is my Rayquaza and Kyogre against the opponent's Whimsicott and Kyogre, with my opponent likely having Primal Groudon unrevealed in the back. I preemptively Mega Evolve Rayquaza, who promptly attacks into Kyogre's Protect, while Whimsicott sets Tailwind before Kyogre drops it to Focus Sash with Ice Beam. But there was no need to Mega Evolve here, and in doing so, I've opened the door for Primal Groudon to come in and nullify my Delta Stream, taking away my Kyogre's damage output and Rayquaza's damage reduction, which is exactly what happens on the following turn. Whimsicott, afraid of Extreme Speed, switches to Primal Groudon, who reclaims the weather, except that this is exactly what I'd hoped for, because I preemptively Mega Evolved Rayquaza specifically to bait this play. My Rayquaza also switches out into Hitmontop. Hitmontop tanks the Ice Beam aimed at Rayquaza, which activates the eject button, and allows me to bring Mega Rayquaza back in on the same turn that it left, reactivating Delta Stream and allowing my Primal Kyogre to one-shot my opponent's Primal Groudon, effectively winning me the game on the spot. Now we do still need to talk more about Xerneas, as it is a pretty rough matchup for Mega Rayquaza. Interestingly, the only other common team that used Xerneas paired it with Mega Rayquaza of their own, and it was called X-Ray. Surprisingly, even though it wasn't designed for it, when playing against this team, the anti-Big 6 mode actually was quite effective, despite many of the Pokemon being different. So against both the common Xerneas teams of Big 6, which was by far the norm, and X-Ray, which was the second most used Xerneas team, we could use the same mode, so Rayquaza wouldn't come. The general rule with this team was that if you saw Xerneas, you left Rayquaza behind, and otherwise, you brought everyone's favorite green dragon. After testing, it was clear that Rayquaza was the right second restricted. It filled the exact offensive role the team needed, clearing a path forward with its ridiculous stats. But now we had a problem, because there was only one slot left, and this slot would need to come versus everything that wasn't Big 6 and X-Ray. We knew that the team probably had enough damage, so the slot could be more support-oriented. But which support Pokemon should it be? Which Pokemon can come against a field full of Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza? And not only come, but contribute. Does such a Pokemon even exist? It does, and it's not a Pokemon you'd ever expect to see competing with these titans. So, last but certainly not least, allow me to introduce one of the most magical Pokemon I have ever used. Raichu is a Pokemon that should not be good, and it certainly should not be world champion material. It is lacking offenses and a defense stat lower than Finneon's. Its main advantage is its speed, but what good is speed without power? Without bulk? How could a Pokemon like Raichu ever hope to compete with Primal Kyogre and Mega Rayquaza? The answer is with extreme precision. Raichu was not a good Pokemon generally in this format. Of the over 100 players at Worlds, only 3 of them would use Raichu who weren't using this specific team, and the best placement Raichu had outside of this team was 23rd. But even though Raichu wasn't good generally, it was the perfect last Pokemon on this team, and no other Pokemon could have done what Raichu did. Part of the reason why has to do with that speed that we were talking about. By outspeeding Mega Kangaskhan, Groudon, Kyogre, and Xerneas, Raichu was able to use certain key moves before some of the biggest threats in the format. Most straightforward is Fake Out, and while this team already has Fake Out with Hitmontop, Fake Out becomes exponentially stronger when there are 2 users on the same team. Double Fake Out has become commonplace nowadays thanks to strong users like Incineroar, Rillaboom, and Iron Hands. But back in the day, it was extremely uncommon to have 2 Fake Out users on the same team because the Fake Out users just weren't that good outside of Kangaskhan. The reason why double Fake Out is so threatening is because Fake Out pressures your opponents to Protect. Because the move is only active on the first turn after a Pokemon hits the field, Protect can nullify the advantage Fake Out seeks to give you. But with double Fake Out, Protect becomes extremely risky, because if you call it out, you can switch from one Fake Out user into the other. And if you're right and your opponent protects both their Pokemon, you will now have Fake Out active while your opponent just burned their safe resource. Raichu's speed also allowed it to support the team with speed control, thanks to its move, Nuzzle. Nuzzle does only a little damage, which might seem inconsequential, but we'll get back to it. But the real reason to use the move is because it paralyzes whatever it hits. Back in Generation 6, Paralysis cut a Pokemon's speed to a quarter rather than the 1/2 that it does now. Paralyzing Xerneas or Rayquaza would often make them a sitting duck, and Kangaskhan and Salamence didn't appreciate the yellow magic either. Nuzzle enabled my Kyogre in a massive way, because remember, the main form of speed control that Kyogre preferred was Trick Room, but in many matchups, Bronzong was left behind. With Nuzzle, there was now another path for Kyogre to outspeed opponents and launch huge water spouts before they could move. Raichu needed an electric type move for damage, and we chose one with a huge secondary benefit. Volt Switch. While it's not very strong, it is nice to get a little chip damage on opposing Kyogre. Though truthfully, the main reason we chose this move was the secondary effect. After damaging an opponent, Volt Switch allows Raichu to switch out. Now this doesn't sound very exciting, and nowadays, moves with this effect are common thanks to Parting Shot and U-Turn. But in 2016, Volt Switch had massive implications. Because remember, the best way to stop Kyogre's water type damage was to switch in Groudon. Volt Switch, in a way, allowed you to cheat your switches. A switch from Volt Switch doesn't occur until the move hits, while hard switches take place at the top of the turn. If both Kyogre and Groudon switched in on the same turn, whoever got control of the weather would be whoever switched in second. But with Volt Switch, you always switched in second. More than this, Volt Switch allowed you to choose your switch after you'd already seen what your opponent went for the turn. So if you had Kyogre out in the field next to Raichu, and you thought there was a chance that Groudon could come in, as long as you correctly predicted which Pokemon was not going to switch, you could wait and see whether or not the opponent was switching in Groudon before choosing whether or not to bring in Rayquaza. Preserving Rayquaza's Focus Sash is really important, and without Volt Switch, you might risk it when you didn't have to if you thought your opponent was going to turn off your rain. But with Volt Switch, you were allowed to wait and see. If Groudon came in comes Rayquaza, down goes Groudon. But if Groudon didn't switch in, then Hitmontop could hit the field instead, providing Intimidate and another Fake Out on the following turn. Volt Switch provided option coverage and let us choose the right Pokemon to bring out after we already knew what the opponent was going for. The last move on Raichu is Special, And I don't just mean to me. It was actually an event-only move that was given out because of Raichu's more famous pre-evolution Pikachu. See, back in 2015, there was a special Wi-Fi tournament called the Pikachu Cup. It was a for-fun online event where only electric-type Pokemon were allowed. And the Pokemon Company said that if at the end of the tournament, Pikachu was in the top 3 most used Pokemon, they would distribute a Pikachu with a special move. Well, thankfully for me, Pikachu snuck in at exactly 3rd in usage. And good to their word, the Pokemon Company sent out a Pikachu with a move that it couldn't normally learn. A move that would prove crucial to me winning the World Championships. A niche move that was the perfect pick for this team, Endeavor. Endeavor lowers the target's health to be exactly equal to the user's. So if Raichu has 100 health left and hits a Kyogre, Kyogre will end up with 100 health left too. This move is almost never seen in competitive play, and when it is, it's normally on a Pokemon with the Focus Sash item to be used after a Pokemon has hit 1 HP. But on this team, Rayquaza had to hold the Focus Sash, and Raichu is super frail. So why on earth was this good? I told you earlier that Raichu could only reach its full potential with extreme precision. And in this case, I'm not talking so much about the moves as I am about the stats. Of course, the stats needed some help, and that's where Raichu's item comes in. The Assault Vest prevents Raichu from using any moves that don't do damage, but in exchange, it increases its special bulk by a whopping 50%. Remember that inconsequential damage that Nuzzle deals? Not so inconsequential now, because just a little damage means you can still use it while holding the Assault Vest. Fake Out and Nuzzle are extremely weak moves, but they do damage, and therefore Raichu could use them. The Assault Vest helps Raichu on the special side, but it's the physical side where it's weakest. And that's why we trained Raichu extremely heavily in its physical defense stat. In order to do this, we didn't run Raichu at max speed, instead going just above Kangaskhan. While there were a few threats that were faster, we needed every point that we could get. The problem is, even training Raichu heavily in its defense stat still wasn't enough to allow it to survive the big attacks of the format. It was still getting knocked out even by not super effective hits, which is where Hitmontop comes in. The duo of Raichu and Hitmontop, made stronger by the eject button allowing Hitmontop to come in when you actually wanted to restrict it on the field, provided the last push that Raichu needed. Now it could survive Kangaskhan Double Edge, but only just barely. Except Raichu barely surviving an attack with low HP turns it from a support Pokemon into a terrifying threat, because suddenly Endeavor would be online. And the physical attacks were not the only ones that Raichu could take. Even super strong moves like Kyogre Origin Pulse in the Rain and Geomancy boosted Xerneas Dazzling Gleam would not KO Raichu. Even the super effective Primal Groudon Earth Power was not guaranteed to KO. At Worlds, my Raichu survived a Life Orb boosted Mega Rayquaza Draco Meteor, and my opponent was banking on it getting the KO. When it didn't, I basically won on the spot. With every stat point meticulously chosen, Raichu ascended past what anyone thought was possible and became a defensive backbone that tied the entire team together in one neat package. Raichu did have one last benefit. Its ability, Lightning Rod. Primal Kyogre only has 2 weaknesses, to Grass and Electric, and Raichu's Lightning Rod ability not only makes it immune to Electric-type moves, it also redirects them away from its partner. This could be used to save Kyogre from opposing Kyogre's Thunders, but it could also be used to stop the ever-annoying Thundurus from paralyzing my entire team with Thunder Wave. Paralysis for me, but not for thee. And with all that, you now understand the team that my friends and I used to win the 2016 Pokemon World Championships. In preparation for this event, I memorized a document that I named the official Calcs document, so I could tell from a single move the item on a Talonflame or the relative bulk on a Xerneas. I knew every attack my Pokemon could and couldn't take, something possible because of how centralized 2016 was as a format. Less viable Pokemon meant memorizing everything was actually something that you could do. There were 4 of us who brought this team to the World Championships in 2016. Brendan, who helped refine the team and pushed us to add Origin Pulse to Kyogre, finished in the top 8 in the middle age division despite not having completed the Delta episode and therefore being unable to Mega Evolve his Rayquaza. Villa, who picked up the team shortly before the tournament, made it all the way to the top 8 in the Masters division. Marcus, who I eliminated in the semifinals for a final placement of 3rd. And of course, yours truly, who won the entire thing from day 1. The only player to win from day 1 actually is a fun fact when tournaments had the ability to skip the first day of the tournament. This team is, in my opinion, a masterpiece, and it very well might be my favorite team that I've ever used. The funny thing is that I've never had a chance to build another team like it, because this team was born in response to the strongest team of all time. And because there's never been another team like Big Six, that also means I've never been able to build another team to stop Big Six, or whatever the next Big Six is called. But in a way, that makes this team even more special in my mind. And I think it should serve as a reminder to all of us who give a part of ourselves to this game, striving to be the best in the world. even when it seems impossible, even when a team seems unbeatable, even when you think the best chance is to give up and just accept that the game has been solved, Pokemon and the people who play it can always evolve further. Now, I do need to address the elephant in the room. What about Worlds itself? You understand the team, yes, but what actually happened on that fateful August weekend over 9 years ago? Isn't there more to this story? I haven't talked about pulling off the single most brutal Big Six shutdown in history, or about having to face off against one of my best friends in the semifinals of the biggest tournament of our lives. I haven't told you about the pressure of being back in Worlds finals for a second time, knowing that the last time I was here, I choked. And I haven't told you about what happened to me midway through day 2, entering a heightened state that I've never experienced since. But once again, the size and scope of this video has gotten away from me, which means I'll have to leave you looking forward to the final part of this trilogy.